When Paula contacted me last week and said, "Can you do Micah chapter 6?" I said, "Wow, that's one of my favorite chapters in the Bible." And so I was really, really glad when she shared that. And I hope that a little bit of the enthusiasm of this chapter will come across. And in just a few minutes, as you know, it's very difficult to summarize such an important chapter, but we will do what we can. As you can see, the chapter is divided into two sections. The first section is where God pleads with Israel, and the language that he uses is legal language. When he says, "I plead your case before the mountains," in verse 1, it's using the same type of legal language that we find in other places like the book of Hosea, where God uses the court language of the time to invoke the seriousness of the situation, because courts make a big difference. Today, I'm privileged to be a witness at a wedding down in Wokingham of one of our members from Marsh Farm. And I've been asked to say some words of blessing at the meal afterwards, because, as you know, at a civil ceremony you can't have a religious element, and they want to bring that in. And I was realizing how, as I was reflecting on this, as I was preparing, what few words of blessing would I be able to share? And Scripture values words. Right from the very beginning, God recalls in Genesis chapter 1 how words were used by God to create the world. And it is words that God has ordained to recreate our worlds. And so when God says in Micah chapter 6 and verse 1, plead your case, it's talking about the most serious words possible that can make a difference between I count you guilty or I count you innocent. And for the one who is being tried, they will either go free and experience the freedom that comes from those incredible words, I find you not guilty, or they go to prison or whatever punishment is in store for them. And if the words are, I find you guilty. And so with exactly the same sort of somber outcome, God is calling on his people and saying, look, not just human beings plead your case, but he says, even the most solid objects possible, like mountains and the hills, let's bring them into the equation. Because what happens is that when human beings defy the law of God and ignore the needs of God's people, his human beings, especially the poor and the suffering, the whole world is in turmoil, and indeed the whole world suffers. And that's what, over the last 50 years especially, that we have been realizing in our world, that the justice of God is about justice for everyone and not just for the few. So, and then he talks about contending with Israel, and this is a discussion, a debate, and he says, why is it that you haven't heard and obeyed what I've asked? And he says, look, I've done everything for you. Verse 4, I brought you up to the land of Egypt. I redeemed you from the house of bondage. In other words, God has saved us. And in response to that salvation, he wants us to act differently. And the culmination of those first few verses, where God is putting his case, is where he says at the end of verse 5, that you may know the righteousness of the Lord. Now that word righteousness, translated in the Greek is dikaiosune, but it's a word that is that is much bigger than our understanding of righteousness today. We tend to think of righteous as simply being a legal thing. Somebody's good, somebody's bad, somebody's righteous, somebody's unrighteous. But in those days, righteousness expressed the whole character of the individual. And so what God was calling for was that the human beings that he had saved from Egypt, Israel, would be the ones who would be counted as righteous and actually would show what God's character is like, his righteous character, his mercy and his grace. And so he then goes on to explain what that would look like, that those who show the righteousness of God, what do they need to do? Well, as with all religious systems, there are duties, there are tasks that people need to follow. And God in his mercy showed what those laws were in the books of Moses that required sacrifices in order to show true observance and obedience with God. And so Micah poetically calls for people and says, what is it that God requires? And you can imagine the chorus of people, and especially the priest, would come back and say, the law says you shall sacrifice, you shall bring offerings, you shall pay your tithe, you shall do everything that is right before God. And Micah kind of exaggerates that. And he says, how many of these burnt offerings will you require? Will God be pleased with thousands of rams? As if recollecting what happened at the temple and the time when it was dedicated, and King Solomon brought thousands of animals to be sacrificed, as if more is better in proving your obedience with God. And then he exaggerates it even more, and he says in verse 7, he says, not only thousands of rams, but 10,000 rivers of oil. It's not just a pot of oil as a sacrifice, but so many pots of oil that they not become just one river, but 10,000 rivers. It's obviously an exaggeration, saying is more better for pleasing God when it comes to bringing sacrifices to the temple of God. And then, of course, the final culmination there. Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? That's recognizing the sacrifices of the pagans around, who continue to offer human sacrifices as if the sacrifice of an individual is of the highest value. And in those days, that's what was regarded as the ultimate one. And that's where the Abrahamic faith changed dramatically from the faith of those around, where God said very clearly, it's not human sacrifice that I require. And so the big question that it all leads up to is, well, what is it that God requires? And then he summarizes it in 3 simple statements. And for those of you who've been to America and perhaps have been around Washington and to one of the great memorials there, you will see this verse, Micah 6, as a summary of what the citizen's duty is when doing what is right. And it says there, he has shown you, O man, what is good. What does the Lord require of you? But that you do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. To do justly is to act with justice in our human relationships. As the Andrew Study Bible puts it, to do justly means literally to act with justice towards other people. The term is ethical and relational. And I thought, yes, so what does that mean? And rather than just my words, Micah then unpacks this when he looks at the second section of the chapter, which looks at the punishment for Israel's injustice because they haven't been behaving justly. And he explains what injustice is. And in verse 10, it talks about the people storing up treasures of wickedness in the house of the wicked. Basically, those who've made illicit profit and gains out of the poor. And he explains how that happens in verse 11, that they use wicked scales and deceitful weights. In other words, they cheat people out of what is fair and what is right. And then in verse 12, it goes, the men are full of violence. And that's the way that often in the past and still today, rich people maintain their riches, because when poor people owe them money, they threaten them with violence and they actually do violence. And for those of you who know what happens on our streets, especially in the illicit area of drugs, and violence rules the world there. And often rich people get their money out of violence by doing that. And they have spoken lies and deceived in order to do that. And so to do justly is to think, what is it that I am doing today to deceive others? And we pat ourselves on the back at one of my phrases and say, well, I don't go about with wicked scales and deceive people. For those of you who know business people, you will know that the temptation in business is always to get more for less, to get the best price you can. And that's the capitalist system we're part of. But the principle is that we should never exploit those who are poor simply to be able to get more for ourselves. And the balance to doing justly is to love mercy, which, again, as it says in the Andrew Study Bible, is to love being merciful. And so how does grace, how does mercy come into our everyday lives and our experiences? It's one of the hardest things to learn how to do when someone has upset us, when someone has acted unjustly, when someone seems to have ended up in difficulty, for us to say, well, you haven't got what you deserved, or you're getting just what you deserve, and what should I do in response to that? And God says here, don't let people suffer with what they deserve. Give them grace and give them mercy instead, because my heart is for every human being. I love everyone, and no one deserves the grace that I want to give them, but because of my love, I give it to them. And so out of the righteousness of God, as we found in verse 5, we ourselves are then enabled to act with mercy towards other people. If you notice some people who have not been very merciful in the way they treat others, could it be that they simply have not experienced the righteousness and the mercy of God for themselves? And so finally, he says to walk humbly with your God. And to walk humbly means to have an attitude of humble wisdom in response to God. And that humble wisdom teaches us to measure our days, to recognize our own frailty, and to humbly accept God's way as being better than ours, and to turn to him in a relationship. So after the two aspects of walking humbly, of doing justice and doing mercy, to walk humbly with God is a reflection that all that we do is in the context of this incredible righteousness that God gives us. And what God wants is for us to seek his face. And when we seek his face, we will turn and change the way that we work and we minister to other people.